Welcome to Coming Clean, the podcast dedicated to common sense environmental dialogue, environmental optimism, and real environmental solutions. This show is proudly powered by Ørsted. Welcome back to another episode of Coming Clean with your host, Benji Backer. I am joined by my friend Curtis Moore today, who's the VP of Corporate Development at Energy Fuels. And the reason that we're having Curtis on is there's many reasons, but one of the most important ones is that he is obviously the VP of Energy Fuels, but that company is the leading U.S. producer of uranium in the United States, also mines for other critical minerals for other clean energy industries. But they were directly impacted by the recent decision by President Biden to set aside 1 million acres of land near the Grand Canyon in a place that they have coined the term Baj Nawahvjo. I think I got that right. But really excited to have Curtis here to talk about that process and what that means for the future of energy production in the United States, of mineral production in the United States, especially because they operate a mine, the only operating mine in the border of this new monument. So, Curtis, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Benji. It's a pleasure to chat with you today.
Yeah, I'm really excited for you to share your insight into this because I thought the response that the company gave was a very nuanced one. Wasn't saying that we should, not protect this land because you guys obviously care about the environment and what's going on in that area and the importance of it to local communities, but also saying that there is, a need for energy development and there's no perfect place to do that. But before we get into that, I just think it's helpful to go over what this actually means for the local environment there. So basically 2 weeks ago, President Biden announced this new national monument, 1 million acres, like I said. It's meant to preserve land that includes canyons, plateaus, a lot of plants and wildlife that are unique to that area. The Native American communities locally, a lot of them were hoping that this would happen because they see this area as a significant place for their community. Of course, this is a very politically relevant state. And so President Biden, by doing this, of course, aids his efforts to get reelected in 2024. It doesn't hurt for sure. And he also tied this issue to climate change and the importance of preserving this acreage, which I'm not exactly sure what the connection to that is, but would love to get into that as well. But so there's a lot of positives there in terms of preserving that land and serving, the Native American communities that, see this as an important place. But as we'll talk about today, it lessens the ability to mine for the critical minerals that we need for our clean energy future. One of those is uranium, and that's obviously what we need for fuel for nuclear energy. So I guess broadly speaking, what do you think about the decision by the Biden administration, and how does it impact your ability as a company, as the only company operating within that boundary, to continue doing business there?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Benji, it is an extremely complicated issue, right? The Grand Canyon is one of the great natural wonders of the world. I myself have spent honestly probably more time in the Grand Canyon than most people. One of my big hobbies is actually whitewater floating and rafting and that sort of thing. I've actually rowed my own boat down the Grand Canyon a couple of times. It is honestly a life-changing experience. I cannot recommend that experience more to people. And so I understand what people are trying to do in terms of, wanting to protect the Grand Canyon. But at the same time, some of America's most valuable, richest uranium deposits also occur in that region. We can't help where uranium occurs, and of course, uranium is the fuel for nuclear energy. President Biden talked about this monument being necessary for the for climate change, but at the same time, uranium, which is used for nuclear energy, and nuclear provides about 20% of all electricity in the United States and about 50% of our carbon-free electricity in the United States. And now, through this action, we've cut off some of our best fuel for this carbon-free electricity. So, there's a lot of paradoxes here. There's a lot of contradictions. I'll also say there's a lot of just sort of flat out misinformation surrounding uranium mining and these issues. And in terms of our operations, we do have a mine that is about to go into operation. We don't think it's going to be impacted by this monument designation, but one of the problems is that now all future uranium deposits and all future mines in that region are now going to be cut off. I think that this was maybe a case where politics sort of took the forefront to science and to reasonable policy, but I'm not the one in charge. So
Right.
again, there are a whole host of issues we can talk about here.
Yeah, and one of the first ones that I want to touch on, just so people get a lay of the land, is so the Grand Canyon is obviously protected by the National Park Service. It has been for a very long time. What's different about this? Where is this relative to it? And I know you guys have this mine that's about to go into operation about 10 miles south of Grand Canyon. Is this just expanding the region around the Grand Canyon? Can you explain that?
Yeah. So as you said, the Grand Canyon has been inside of a national park, I think, since 1919, and so it's been protected within a national park for over 100 years. And I believe that the current size of the national park is about 1.3 million acres. And I think, a lot of people have trouble trying to visualize how big that is, but it is a huge piece of land. I mean, I don't know how that compares to, say, the size of states like Rhode Island or, Delaware or some of our smaller states, but it's a big chunk of states, right? When you're talking about that much land. And so this new monument designation basically was land near the Grand Canyon, right outside the Grand Canyon National Park. And I think it was a little over 900,000 acres. So now ostensibly there's over 2 million acres that's now been set aside for the protection of the Grand Canyon. And again, I get it why people want to protect the Grand Canyon, but these uranium deposits that occur there, these are a part of the natural environment there. Whether you're mining them or not, these things are going to erode inside the Grand Canyon eventually. They are very rich. They've been mined actually since the late 1970s with zero adverse impacts to the environment, to groundwater, to really, to wildlife, to anything in the region. And again, we just think this was possibly an example of, science and facts on the ground taking kind of a backseat to politics. Now, I'll also back up real quickly and say, I also understand why Native American communities are skeptical of uranium mining because a lot of the historic uranium mining that occurred in the United States, kind of back in the Cold War, back in the 1950s into the 1960s. And again, this was a totally different era. This is when uranium mining was essentially a government defense program because we were building up our nuclear arsenal. This is kind of before the days of nuclear energy and understanding the benefits of nuclear and the carbon-free aspects of it. And a lot of that stuff happened on native land. And there was a lot of contamination, a lot of health impacts, a lot of things that happened to them that
All
still
right.
persists today, to their parents, their grandparents, their ancestors, and all that. And so I understand the skepticism of it, but unfortunately, I think there's some anti-nuclear groups that are out there that are sort of exploiting that skepticism to oppose uranium mining and their broader efforts to stop nuclear energy, which I think is kind of a shame.
Well, they're applying the technologies and the ways of the world from the 50s, 60s when we were desperately trying to compete globally in a Cold War with really bad technology and really bad environmental standards. They're comparing that to today, and of course, instilling a lot of fear in a lot of people's minds about this. Uh, you know, as you said, this has been happening near the Grand Canyon for a long time. It doesn't have an impact on the Grand Canyon because it's not in the Grand Canyon, and it's also not changing the landscape. When people think of mining, they think of these huge excavations of land. And I mean, I live in Arizona, so I'm familiar with this. I mean, even when you fly into Phoenix, you can see going over the mountains multiple areas where that have just been completely destroyed by copper mines and other areas or other materials. That is obviously necessary in wherever it is in the world. Somewhere is going to have to look like that for us to get those materials. But of course, people are like, okay, well, I don't want something to look like that near the Grand Canyon. Can you explain if that's what it would look like if you guys were able to do what you want to do in that area? And if not, why is it different?
Yeah, no, it won't. These deposits I'm talking about are really unique. They're called breccia pipes. And so, and what I ask people to do is imagine a pipe standing on its end, and that pipe is maybe 50 to 150 feet in diameter, and maybe 1,500 feet to maybe 2,000 feet tall. And so these deposits are actually mined using small underground mining techniques. So you're not going to see a big open pit mine or a massive disturbance of the land on the surface. Actually, the total surface disturbance of these mines is about 15 acre, which is probably about the size of your average grocery store, right? And it's not what a lot of people think about when you think about mining, but the uranium that is contained within that tiny little area is massive. And again, keeping in mind that this is carbon-free, clean electricity, clean power. And so it's so you'll have about 15 acres of total disturbance. You'll see a head frame, which is basically just kind of a metal structure that operates basically an elevator that goes down into the deposit. Up to like Pinion Plain, our mine that we're starting up right now, goes down to about 1,500 feet. You kind of mine that deposit out from the side. You bring the ore up to the surface, and then you don't process that ore on the site. You actually take it to a mill. We own a mill in Southeast Utah. You truck it over there, and that's where you recover the uranium. And keeping in mind, this is all just natural uranium. This is actually not highly radioactive material. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about uranium and honestly about radiation in a lot of respects. But this is not highly enriched. It's not ready to be put into a nuclear reactor. It has to go through a lot more processing before it can produce electricity. In the grand scheme of this stuff is actually pretty benign. I've heard it said that the hazards of natural uranium, again, this is uranium as it occurs in nature, is not that it's radioactive, is that it's toxic. It's a heavy metal. It's kind of like you don't want to eat lead, you don't want to eat uranium. So, that's more what we're talking about here. But once we're done, these mines typically only last for about 4, 5, 6 years, so they're fairly short-lived. Once we're done, we remove all the structures from that site. We remove any, kind of residual hot spots that might be on the surface. That's just sort of soil or rock, that maybe contains some uranium in it. We remove that, take that to the mill. We plug the shaft, and that's it. I mean, you can actually go back to using this land for camping. You can graze on it. You can use it for wildlife conservation, whatever you want after we're done with it. This is about as low impact as commercial mining gets.
And so the only impacts that would be visible to the eye are really under the ground,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's above ground, there's not really much of an impact. Is
Exactly.
that correct? So, what are the concerns that people have, whether that's native communities or local environmental organizations, and what would you say are wrong about those concerns or right?
Yeah, so I'd say that the biggest concern that we hear about is the potential for groundwater contamination. Again, for my, drawing on my experience from the being down in the Grand Canyon for a long time, there are these springs and these seeps that just literally come gushing out of the canyon walls. It's really a sight to behold. Where there's this beautiful water, almost like little gardens of Eden down there
Yeah.
in the middle of the desert. Keeping in mind, right? I mean, this is a very arid part of the world, and there's flowers, there's wildlife, there's amazing vegetation, there's just this clear water, cold water coming out of the canyon walls. And so I think a lot of the concern that people have is that somehow those springs or somehow these water sources would become contaminated. One of the main ones is called Havasu Creek, which is probably about 40 miles to the northwest of our mine site right there. And I mean, you go down there, it's like these turquoise blue waters and travertine pools and falls. I mean, I can go on and on about how amazing this stuff is, but there's people that have been led to believe that there's some risk of contamination from these little mines to sources of water like Havasu Creek and Havasu Springs and all that, when there is just literally no science to support that. These things have been studied extensively. We have a great knowledge of the groundwater systems, of the geology, of the hydrogeology, all that to know that there's just no connection between these mines and these aquifers that feed those springs. Yeah, again, I could go through our permits. I could go through all the studies. I mean, there is just a crazy amount of science that shows that there's just zero risk to those things in the Grand Canyon or to any groundwater. But I think that's one of the biggest risks that people see. And again, this historic uranium mining that occurred like on the Navajo Nation from back in the 50s and 60s, those were totally different deposits in a totally different part of the world. Where there was groundwater contamination that occurred, and actually some of that is still persisting today. Now it's a lot of that is based on the historic practices they used, and there's just look, things were a lot different in the 50s and 60s. I mean, look at the cars we were driving, right?
Right.
It's really no different in heavy industry, and when you're talking about you know the mining that's required. I mean, we've evolved and we've gotten better, just like everybody has.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, and from what I'm getting here is that scientifically it's backed up that this is a very non-invasive way to get material, and obviously far less invasive than, let's say, a lithium mine in the Congo or something, where you're really destroying the environment, or a copper mine. And not to say that we don't need those things. We
Yeah.
do need those materials for our future, but this seems to be fairly low in terms of its intensity to the local environment. I guess for people who would say, okay, maybe that's true, but we still don't want to risk the groundwater near the Grand Canyon being affected. We don't want to risk having even 15 acres underground be impacted. Let's just do it somewhere else. I was reading that, this is potentially a very small percentage of the uranium deposits in the United States. What would you say to people who have kind of that pushback of saying, you know what, let's just try to do it somewhere else? Is that an easy thing to do, or what makes that complicated if not?
Well, we don't choose where the uranium is, right?
Right.
It is where it is, and these are the highest grade uranium deposits in the United States. And when you're talking about grade, that refers to the richness of the uranium in the rock, in the ore that you pull out. These are actually some of the highest grade uranium deposits in the world, actually outside of Canada. Um, and definitely the highest grade uranium deposits in the United States. And when you're talking about high grade, that usually also relates to lower cost. So it doesn't cost as much. You don't have to move as much rock to recover the amount of uranium that you need when it's higher grade. It refers to lower impact. It refers to higher accessibility and all that. And so yeah, I mean, there's uranium. But look, uranium is one of the most common elements in the Earth's crust. Believe it or not, it's as common as tin. Okay, so yes, we could recover uranium. You could go out in your backyard and dig that up and probably pull out some uranium, right? But it'd be very expensive. It's not all that accessible. It'd be very destructive, right? And so, that's what that's those are the trade-offs. And when you're talking about mining, when you're talking about just anything that we need for our modern society, there are trade-offs, right? There's no perfect way to do this. We don't have unicorns that'll produce clean electricity for ourselves, right? And so again, these mines have been studied extensively. And again, I think there's been about 9 or 10 of these mines that have operated since the late 1970s. So this is not really a new thing in this area. So these are these particular brecciapite mines that are in northern Arizona, very high grade. They started mining these in the late 1970s. And again, the 70s were kind of a seminal era when that's really when we started caring about the environment. That's when you had the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, NEPA, the Endangered Species Act. All those laws got passed, and there was a much greater consciousness of what you were doing to the environment to produce these minerals. And so these mines started being mined in the late 70s, so almost 50 years ago. And so we have a lot of data, we have a lot of experience with mining these things, and it's been studied extensively. And there's just no impact, no impact to groundwater, no impact to the Grand Canyon, no impact to wildlife. It's been shown that these are just very low impact, very low cost, very valuable clean energy resources, which unfortunately are now tied up in a national monument.
Yeah, it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that there are other uranium deposits around this country, but this is some of the easiest, lowest cost, most
Hmm.
accessible opportunities that we have in this country to find uranium right now,
Yep.
and get it for what we need in the short term. I mean, we've got a nuclear power plant not too far from this, national monument in Arizona, the Palo Verde in nuclear plant. And that, yes, there are other uranium deposits, but they're far harder to reach and far harder to obtain the materials from. Is
Well,
that correct?
yeah, and a much greater environmental impact. mean,
Mm.
yeah, I mean, there's big uranium deposits elsewhere in the United States, but you might actually have to go and create a big open pit mine like those copper mines you were describing, where there is a lot of environmental.
This is where, I mean, sorry to cut you off. I mean, this is where this environmental conversation just gets so backwards because in the name of saving the environment, we're harming the environment
Yeah,
because we have to be able to mine for uranium, for lithium, for cobalt, for copper. And you might as well do it where you're going to have the least amount of environmental impact. And if I had the choice to say 10 miles away from the Grand Canyon, we could have a non-invasive process to get uranium out of the ground in a low-cost way that would lower the cost of energy as well, or we could cancel that because it's close to the Grand Canyon and we're scared of these ramifications that aren't actually going to happen with groundwater and other sorts of environmental impacts. And instead, we're going to move that to, let's say, Wyoming, in another beautiful place where we're going to have a much larger environmental impact for way more money and get the same amount of material. Why are we why are we doing this? I mean, the way that we've been thinking about environmentalism is so based on the surface level, no pun intended, of what sounds good. And so yes, mining near the Grand Canyon to the average person does not sound good. It doesn't sound good to me. I live in Arizona, and the Grand Canyon is one of the few places that I would attribute to creating my love of the environment. But if you can mine for something 10 miles away from there that can power clean energy for this country and not have an impact on the Grand Canyon or the local environment, then why aren't we doing it? And it just seems like we're letting this emotion that we understandably all feel about protecting the environment get in the way of the actual facts and logic of the argument when we know that there are trade offs and we know that there's no perfect place to mine. But all things considered, this would be our best opportunity, or one of the best opportunities to get what we need to power this country with clean electricity without harming the
well,
environment.
and that's you're making some great points here, Benji. Now, keeping in mind, we probably can't power the United States on these mines in Arizona. You know,
Right.
but we should, I would think, try to trend toward having a lower impact on the environment as much as possible. We're still going to need these big mines, in Wyoming or in Canada or in Russia or Africa, wherever these things are, because
Kazakhstan.
this clean energy transition that we're in is great, but it's kind of like, I tell people it's like you may not like fossil fuels, and I get that, but you better love mining because
Right.
we're
Those are the two
moving from a
options.
much less sort of a fuel driven sort of a economy or energy system to a much more sort of material driven sort of an energy system. Whether you're talking about nuclear energy or wind energy or solar power or electric vehicles or all these battery technologies out there, they're very material intensive, and you need materials from mines. And so but we should try to mine those materials in the least invasive way possible. And so that's why these mines we're talking about in Arizona, I think meets that criteria. So yeah, again, there's no perfect way to do this. There's lots of trade offs you have to consider.
Yeah, and I guess when it comes to the trade offs, our politicians should be weighing those trade offs and try to make the best decisions possible. I guess, there's probably a lot of individuals within the Biden administration that push to make this happen. What was that process like? Um, how did it unfold? I mean, you guys, to my understanding, are the only company that would have this amount of stake in the current mining in this area. So how much were you consulted with? How much were you asked about it? I'm sure they tried to include other communities as well. What did that process look like, and how were you guys involved?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I'm happy to talk to you about that. First off, I do want to make it clear that we are pretty grateful to the administration for at least letting our current mine go forward. It appears. Again, we don't agree with the policy of cutting off all these future uranium deposits because, as we've been talking about, these are low impact, low cost, great sources of clean energy for us. It seems to go against a lot of their policies. But that aside, yeah, it was a very quick process. Now, there have been some people out there who have been agitating for a national monument in this location for many, many years. It started to get a little bit of traction this year, where there was a couple of bills introduced in both houses of Congress to create this national monument. And then in April, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, she came and visited this area. Sort of that was in April or May, I think, of this year. Just to listen to the locals about what they thought about a national monument, and then we didn't really hear anything about it. Kind of in early to mid July, we heard that there was a public meeting happening in Flagstaff, Arizona, to gather public comments on a national monument. And we weren't even sure what we were commenting on. I mean, are we commenting on the legislation in Congress? Was the White House considering a monument designation under the Antiquities Act, or what was going on there? And then, and so we participated in that. We submitted a few comments, and then come whatever it was in early August, next thing you know, the president declared a monument under the Antiquities Act. It was a very rushed process. I think there wasn't at least, look, I don't want to say that the White House didn't really think about, the ramifications of all this, but I do think the politics played a lot of this, but yeah, I just think we just need to just keep doing our work to informing people and making sure that people know that we've got a great clean energy resource there that can be mined responsibly. So we shouldn't cut it off permanently.
Well, and you look at who was there, and obviously President Biden and Governor Katie Hobbs, were present, and it does seem to be a political stunt in a lot of ways. Again, that's not to say that there's not a reason to do it. A lot of good things happen for political stunts, but it does seem like this was something that wasn't well thought through. After hearing you talk about how quick and rushed and not inclusive the process was. Like you said, it's good that they've set aside the ability to, at least for now, keep going with what you've built, with this one mine that you have planned. But it just seems like, again, the trade-offs weren't considered. And when I was, I didn't watch the entire press conference, but when I read kind of the quotes, it seemed like a little backwards. Like, oh, we're doing this to fight against climate change. And it's like, how does setting aside land in a desert fight climate change when there's no, it's not, nothing before or after is changing up lower or higher carbon emissions. Like, it's not increasing or decreasing carbon emissions at all. And in fact, one could argue, to your point, that it's decreasing our ability to use clean energy because we have to rely on other countries or just not have the fuel that we need for our clean energy sources like nuclear. So it does seem like, everyone hearing from President Biden that setting aside this land is so good for the climate, like, sounds really good, but then it's like, where's the merit to that? And if there is merit, can you tell us why? And I don't know if President Biden would be able to answer, why is this good for the climate? I can see why it's justified to be good for Native communities. They want this to be protected. It's a sacred site for them. Whatever. I can see why conservationists would want it. But I don't see their main reason that they talked about was the climate. And from my understanding, from this conversation and from everything I've read, it actually would have a negative impact on the climate. But yet they're branding it as that a year before a presidential election in a state that's purple. It just does seem a little bit weird.
I don't disagree. You'll have to ask them how this will improve the climate problem.
I'm not sure they want to be asked for that, but I digress. I mean, I guess what I really get frustrated by, again, is just that this environmental conversation is being distracted by the politics. And of course, we've talked about this. It's really bad on the other side too. I mean, I'm being critical of the Biden administration. I mean, I think Trump would probably go to the opposite side and say we should be doing as much as we want on these lands without caring. I mean, that's bad. That's really bad too. So there's a middle ground to be found, but it doesn't seem like the Biden administration was interested in that. And that's obviously not unique to the Biden administration with how politics are these days.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's politically, it's very appealing to be saving the Grand Canyon in the Grand Canyon state.
Yeah.
And like you said,
or to be appear as doing that.
Yeah, appearing to do that.
They don't want to get it conflated. I mean, the Grand Canyon's protected. That will be protected for eternity.
Yes.
This is the area around the Grand Canyon, which should be protected as well. and I think that you would argue should be as well, and that this doesn't get in the way of protecting
Yeah,
the
yeah, and,
area.
and just because there's not a national monument there doesn't mean that land that is now in the monument is going to be overrun by a bunch of uranium mines. I mean,
Right,
you still have to go through an extensive and very detailed multi-year permitting process to ensure that you're not going to affect groundwater or affect
right.
wildlife or the environment in any health or any. So
Well, yeah, I mean, that's even separately its own conversation right now is whether or not the permitting process should take so long. And even Democrats have been against it being such a cumbersome process. And so, like you said, even if it's not a national monument, that doesn't mean you can just overrun it.
yeah.
I mean, you have almost a decade long process without a national monument to be able to actually do
Well,
something in that
and
area.
I don't know if this is getting off track, but this whole thing about creating these national monuments, just because you slap a monument designation on a bunch of land doesn't mean that the resources to manage that land are there, right? Where
Right.
it takes money to have rangers, to have roads, to have trails, to have visitor centers, interpretive signs, all that kind of stuff, and it's I think I've personally seen this like with Bears Ears National Monument that got declared in southeast Utah. You used to be able to go out on these roads and see nobody out there. Now all of a sudden you put a monument designation and it's like a magnet for all these people to go out
Hmm.
there, and it's starting to be kind of overrun with people, and there's no money to actually manage it. I mean, in some respects, I wonder if it's further degrading the land by declaring
Right.
monuments without funding to manage it.
Well, yeah, and that's a big problem. And where do you get the funding? It's
Right.
really easy to say, oh, just fund them more. It's like we helped pass a bill in 2013 to fund our national park system. Again, very much in favor of protecting these lands.
100%.
It was really difficult to get that across the finish line because they were billions of dollars in debt. These are just national parks, not national monuments, not national forests, which are often way, way, way more under.
Yep.
Um, and it took almost a decade to get that policy across the finish line, and it only funded up until that point. So now it's back into debt again.
Yep.
So it's a really difficult process, and what sounds good not necessarily is always good. Um, we only have time for two more questions. I've got two really important ones, I think, and one of them is when you think about mining in the United States, and I'm not just talking about uranium, but you know this landscape really well. Most of the areas that are mined or available for mining in the United States are going to be in non-developed natural areas,
Mhm.
whether that's in the boundary waters in Minnesota or uh, in the foothills of the mountains in Wyoming or near the Grand Canyon. How do you see this playing out? How do you see the future of mining in this country playing out when so many of the deposits of minerals are in the most beautiful places or they're in sacred spots for Native American communities? Do you see us just continuing to go overseas for this because it's out of sight, out of mind, or do you feel like there needs to be or will be a return to being willing to do this in the United States? How do you see the future of mining playing out when the natural spaces are going to be affected by this?
I think a lot of it will depend on how educated citizens are and ordinary voters are. Um, Today, if nothing changes, I think we'll continue to offshore this, out of sight, out of mind. People want their computers, they want their electric vehicles, they want their reliable energy, their iPhones, whatever it is. But they don't want to think about the icky part of that, right? The mining, the processing, the you know, yeah. I mean, but it is a complete reality with this modern society that we're in. Um, Now, with that being the case, when you start offshoring all this stuff to places, in Africa and Asia and, wherever it is, I can assure you they're not doing it as responsibly as we would do it in the United States. We have the highest environmental health, you know, safety, you name it, whatever, standards are there in the world, we have the highest ones here in the United States. And just because we stop it here in the United States doesn't mean that it's not going to occur somewhere else. And it's probably going to occur somewhere else that doesn't do it to nearly the high standards that we do here in the United States. Um, so I would like to think that people will become more educated about where their things come from. Where does your cell phone come from? Where does your computer come from? Where does your car come from? Where does your house come from? Whatever it is, and and then understand that that stuff had to be mined or it had to be grown. Okay, and that's
Yep.
look, everything around you was mined or it was grown. That's the truth. And so just because, again, you're stopping it here in the States doesn't mean that it's not happening. And so having that lowest possible impact on the environment, we need to do some of that stuff here in the United States.
I completely agree. And if we don't, we're just going to destroy the rest of the world. And honestly, I think that there is an argument. And I'm not, you probably can't say this, but I would say that this is an argument to try to diversify the future of energy in this world. I mean, we don't have enough ability to mine for everything in this entire planet for the demand that we have for transportation, for laptops, for phones, for everything, without severely impacting the look and the topography of our planet. And if that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, and that doesn't mean that technology can't get better, or that won't be a huge part of our mix. It absolutely will be. It has to be.
Oh,
But that also means
we need to be investing in recycling as well, right? I mean,
right.
so it's still much more expensive to recycle these materials today, but maybe in the future it won't be. So we need to keep investing in those technologies as well.
Exactly, and figuring out, and honestly, it's a perfect example of why taking advantage of a really easy way to get, a mineral like uranium um, out of the ground in a way that would be non-invasive. We should take every chance we can get to to get those easy wins for our planet. And if we can't say yes to those, then what are we going to say yes to?
Right.
It seems like we're just always no, 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 no. If it impacts us in any way, or if it's in our backyards, but we're yes when it doesn't affect us at all. But it does impact somewhere. So I guess the last kind of question that I have, and this is kind of what I want the listeners to leave with, is when we talked last week about this issue, you brought up how important the environment is to you and to the company, but also just how involved you are in protecting these sorts of similar spaces in Utah and in Colorado. You obviously mentioned your time in the Grand Canyon. Can you just quickly, I think a lot of people would say, okay, well, sure, what he's saying makes sense, but he's just, an executive at an energy company living in a city and probably doesn't really have a personal stake in this. It seems like you do based on our conversation. I would love for you to just share that so that people have an understanding of kind of the balanced view that you're trying to come at with this.
Well, yeah, I'm not just, yeah, and again, I'm not doing it just to, try to put a veneer on any of this at all either. I mean, this is something I've been passionate about my whole life. And so, yeah, I mean, I already talked about some of the probably the most meaningful moments of my life was floating the Grand Canyon and just dropping out of the world for for weeks on end, and floating down and all the I'm just seeing the just the natural beauty of God's creation. I mean, it's just it's mind blowing. And again, I would encourage you and any of your listeners to take a trip down there just to see it. But yeah, I mean, I serve on the board of a it's a nonprofit that supports national parks in the region of southeast Utah and eastern Utah. That's Arches National Park and Canyonlands National Park, Hovenweep National Monument, and Natural Bridges National Monument. We raise money to support the Park Service in ways, like you said, it's hard to get funding for these things. And so we raise private money to try to support the parks. And it may seem like a paradox or a contradiction for a uranium executive to be serving as I'm actually currently president of the board of this of this nonprofit to have these experiences and to go out and experience these regions and these landscapes of my own. I mean, it's something that I'll be doing long after I'm not in this industry anymore because we got to protect these places for future generations. And yeah, I don't know. It's a wonderful opportunity I have.
Yeah, and I would tell you that, before I got into this space so heavily, I was pretty adverse to mining, oil and gas, all the different things that sounded really bad. And, I obviously still have concerns over so many different things around environmental issues. But the people well, obviously the facts that that are around these things that don't get talked about are important. That's what we talked about for most of this episode. But also the human aspect is really important. And there's this kind of belief of this evil bad guy at the top of the mining company that just wants to destroy the environment. I think of like the equivalent of the movie Rango, where there's like the mayor is hiding all the water because they don't want anyone to have it because they are going to get all the money
I
from
love that movie.
starting it. It's a great movie. 10 out of 10, one of the best animated movies.
Yes.
But that's just not how it is. And, I've talked to, your CEO and you at length about this and on many other executives at similar companies. And one of the reasons that you're involved in this is because you know this space so well. You care about this planet and the environment that you're
Well, and
working with.
I want to cut you off, and that's not just us. This is all. I don't
Right.
want to take all the credit for this or our CEO. This
No,
is
I know it's the
all the way down
industry.
the organization.
Right.
And so this is an ethic, and I think just a point of view that everybody has in our organization.
Well,
Nobody
even when I toured mine,
wants to destroy the environment. Nobody,
right.
I live in Denver, like you said, but like our mill in Utah, I mean, those people live out there, right? They don't want to
Right. I
destroy
mean,
their
meeting with
home.
Logan,
Yeah.
meeting with Logan at the
Yeah.
mill, a couple of months ago, asking him what he does for fun on the weekends, and it's everything's outside.
Yeah.
Everything is out in
Yep.
nature.
Yep.
So there's a deep connection for people at Energy Fuels in the industry, and they want to find a way to balance environmental protection with the demand that we have for clean energy at the same time.
Exactly.
And I appreciate your leadership on that. I appreciate you coming on and talking about this so candidly. I know it's been a hectic few weeks, so fitting in time for this is much appreciated. And hopefully this helps our audience understand kind of the difficulties behind these conversations, but also the opportunity that there lies ahead. We just need to be a lot more sensible about it. And you've been leading from the front on that, so I appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate your having me on, Benji.
Awesome. And before we jump, the Coming Clean podcast is grateful to be powered by Ørsted, a wonderful company strengthening America's energy security with reliable and domestic clean energy. Through its integrated renewable energy solutions, Ørsted is creating American jobs, investing in American communities, and driving American innovation, all while preserving our country's natural habitats. A clean energy future truly connects us all, and Ørsted is helping lead the charge. To learn more, visit us.orsted.com.